Someone she's someone I went to law school with and have known ever since. Her history is that she also worked at the state bar, governing sort of ethics for all of us lawyers in Montana and made us be ethical. And with retirement, she became passionate about what is happening with our judiciary. And I wanted her to talk about a grassroots effort that she put together in Montana that has been enormously effective in combating many of the issues that we're seeing happening throughout the US. And it is, in fact, the same game plan that the ultra conservative right has been using throughout the US and many of our states, but to great effect at the US Supreme Court as well. And so I thought her topic is really relevant to all of us, even though her experience is uniquely in Montana. And so, with that, Betsy, can you give me a bit of your background? And our intention is to do this in a bit of a question and answer format because Betsy and I have worked together many years. And I think by both of us talking and asking questions, we'll get more out. But we also hope that anyone who's interested, share a question. Betsy will watch the chat. I'll watch the chat, and we'll certainly try to respond to those as well. So, Betsy, with that, can you give me a bit of your background to the extent I didn't touch on it?
Oh, hi everybody. It is so wonderful to be able to talk to you about this issue because this is something that's taking root nationwide. I was fortunate after I graduated from the American University in Washington, D.C., to get a job with Senator Max Baucus, who at that time was the chair of the Finance Committee and very involved in the Judiciary Committee. And from there, I went to law school with Laura in Montana because you go to law school where you want to practice. My family has really deep roots in this state. And then I ended up as a Montana Supreme Court law clerk. And from there, I was in the Attorney General's office doing a whole series of different responsibilities and, prosecuting and defending and doing all sorts of cool stuff. And from there, they asked me to be the general counsel at the State Bar of Montana, which is the entity that regulates lawyers. And I said, well, what is there to do? And I still have the memo that they gave me that said, here's what you should be doing. But then I went ahead and created an entire job and had a blast doing it for 26 years. And it wasn't just with the ethics, it was just working with the lawyers. And when Laura and I started, there were about 2,500 lawyers in Montana practicing, and now I think there's close to 4,000. So over 26 years of teaching continuing legal education classes, I got to know a lot of lawyers. And then, Laura, I'm going to just blast into how I started this nonprofit. So I retired in 2021. No, when did I retire? Well, anyway, I retired and I got bored, but I also got sick in the way that, where your brain functions, but your body doesn't. And so I got busy and looked at, because I was still in the trenches, looked at what was coming up for the next legislative session. And our legislature only meets every other year in odd years. And what was interesting to me is usually there are about 5 bills impacting lawyers, and it was my job to deal with those during the 26 years of working. But this time, when I looked, there were 50 proposed bills impacting the judicial branch. And that was very odd. And I went to my former employer and said, what are you going to do about this? And they said, oh, don't worry, we've got it handled. And they had no idea what was coming down the pike. And, I could see the train, and it was a train, and that we were in trouble. And then the Chief Justice came to the meeting and he said, we're in trouble, but he tapped it out in judge speak. And I'm not sure everybody heard what he was saying because nobody historically on the board at that time was practicing much in front of the Supreme Court. But since I knew what I was hearing, I was like, uh-oh, we're in trouble. Mm. So when I knew that nobody was going to deal with this, I reached out to a friend of mine who is a seasoned lobbyist, and I said, "Can you help me think about how to deal with this?" And what we ended up doing, he said, "Sure," and he added two of his friends who were also my friends, and Laura knows them both. And eventually we became an IRS recognized 501(c)(3). And what we initially did with those 50 bills is I figured 50 lawyers that I knew would make phone calls and do things with our legislature because of the way Montana is connected. I like to say that it's the 2 degrees of separation. Because if I was doing my job with the lawyers for 26 years, everybody knew who I was because I was teaching continuing legal education all over the state. So pretty much people knew who I was. So I just went ahead and I reached out to like former governors, everybody I could think of that I knew would actually do stuff. And we, at the end of that, it was the 2023 session, and lawyers had to join themselves, and I was using my private email. And at the end of that session, a gift from a friend helped us create a website, and I figured out how to create something other than my personal email. And by the end of that session, there were 1,400 bills, 240 were addressing the courts, and there were 61 proposed constitutional amendments, 9 focusing on the judiciary. And we killed.
And this is just in Montana,
This
correct?
is just in Montana, and I'm going to talk about the national thing in a minute. But that little group of 50 that grew to 250, and Laura was part of the initial 50, and it was by word of mouth because people started to recognize that we were in trouble, and they weren't necessarily showing up at the legislature. They were doing background phone calls and saying, "What is going on here?" So, but it was a bloodbath, and it took a lot out of all of us. And then they created a special session in 2024 where the ultra conservatives got together and they came up with 27 specific bills that again went on attack. And the strategy again was to flood the zone. And by the end of the last session, we looked up 148 drafted bills and another 108 the 148 was submitted and 108 were on the back burner waiting for us. And as of today, our subscriber list on our emails is nearly 2,900 people, mostly lawyers. And we ended up during the last session actually hiring lobbyists, so I had to do some fundraising. And this isn't so bad for a group of people whose average age is 73. So that's kind of what Friends of the Third Branch, how it happened. It just grew organically. What happened was in tracking the bills, what we learned was that people were just desperate for the legislators and the lobbyists were desperate for information about these bills because they were very dense on the different judicial issues, and our legislative sessions are only 4 months every other year. And nobody is an expert on all those things. So, of course, the lobbyists have a huge voice. And the bills were essentially in 4 or 5 categories. They were challenging how the judges in Montana are elected. They wanted to reduce the court's powers, district courts and our Supreme Court. They wanted to create new courts so that everything that had a constitutional edge would go to a separate court And I'll talk more about that in a minute, I think. And they just generally were trying to increase as much as they possibly could the legislative and executive control over the courts. Now, this is relevant to the national discussion, and news flash from yesterday, they had a continuing education program on the for judges that was judges only, and 200 judges participated in it, and they talked about Montana, and they said what has happened in those four categories, that the other states are all confronting these challenges at their legislative level, um, and that the strategy has been in those states to pick one of those areas, challenging how judges are elected, or reducing the court's powers, or creating new courts. But Montana was unique because they flooded the zone. They did all the attacks all the time, and just swept it. And we didn't have I, we were just bailing as quickly as possible. We didn't know how special we were, and apparently we were really special to the point where they we had a guy out from the Brennan Center for Justice, and they've been tracking this stuff pretty closely. And he was saying Montana is the petri dish for what's going to happen in the other states. And the idea that this is just generally undermining the whole separation of powers principles in the state and federal constitutions. And we're in trouble in a big way.
And would it be accurate to say this has already happened at the federal level?
It's already happened at the federal level.
And how did it happen at the federal level?
Well, why don't you rip on that for a minute? Because we were talking about it. I think you should.
Well, and I think we're now moving from the federal level down to the state level. What happened at the federal level, we've all watched happen as they stalled the nomination and appointment of Merrick Garland to the U.S. Supreme Court. Then they have installed as many conservative justices as they could. But the other thing I think you need to look at is they have been very, very deliberate about it. It has happened by placing the right kids in the right colleges in Harvard and Yale and Notre Dame, getting them to the right internships and fellowships, and getting them in line. If you're Amy Coney Barrett or one of them, they all got handpicked to move through this system. Now what's happening is it's happening at the state level, and all of us need to get a lot more proactive, because ground roots, the states all have our own independent rights that protect women, children, and civil rights in general. And we've seen women's rights were won at the court level with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the issues of equal rights, equal pay, Roe versus Wade. All of those decisions were not particularly statutory results. They were results of Supreme Court judicial decisions. And you have watched over the last couple of years, Roe versus Wade got overturned. The Hobby Lobby decision, where court companies can, on religious grounds, restrict insurance coverage for contraception. HIV treatment can be restricted. Affirmative action for college admission got struck down. That was one of the most active ways that women got into the higher level colleges. Not only did affirmative action help people of color, it helped the women get these placements. And so this has now all happened at the federal level. We all need to be looking at what's happening at the state level, because now the focus has shifted.
Yeah. So the statistic thrown out in a different program where I can, if you want to learn more about this, is that 97% of all court matters are in state courts. And then with the frustration that everyone's had with the U.S. Supreme Court decisions that Laura was talking about, like Roe versus Wade, it's not just women's issues and reproductive rights, it's land use, environment, education, climate change. They were so frustrated with all that what they've been doing at the Supreme Court level is ceding the responsibilities, and you guys know this already, to the states and to the legislatures to hammer out how the states are going to address these different issues. So the Supreme Court has essentially ceded most authority on some of these larger issues, or it can, and I think it's going to continue for a while, to the state courts. So there's increasing national pressure on the state courts. So and it's just astounding how quickly this caught fire and how quickly they're moving with the Project 2025 agenda, which is pretty much, it's a coordinated effort. There is a playbook. It's all based in the broad mistrust of our governmental institutions. And, you know, the Project 2025 playbook just centers on divinity as the source of Americans' rights. So we're in a odd time, you know, that interesting time. And the Brennan Center has more material on that too. But nationwide, what their statistics establish is that between 2020 and 2024, and that's without what just happened in Montana with our huge wave. So without Montana's numbers, there were 442 bills introduced nationwide to impact these different topic areas, and 47 of those passed. And I kind of refer to it sometimes as being nibbled to death by guppies. People don't see the impact of these changes, and the issues are so dense, it's hard to track. So we need women like this group to start engaging, because as with my little group, nobody knew what was going on until we told them. And they didn't appreciate the significance. And then because I was going to rallies and handing out one-page fact sheets, and I want to talk about those in a second, they got the vocabulary and they started to see what was happening, and they were mobilizing. The League of Women Voters mobilized around our stuff, and actually about 30 other nonprofits got busy, and we were what they needed. And what we were doing that was unique and helpful was creating these one-page or two-page fact sheets going, writs of mandamus, here's what those are. Here's why this is going to hurt everyone if they get this bill through. Partisan judicial races, here's how it's going to hurt everybody if this goes through. And and the other thing that was critical, and I'm going to kind of interrupt my train of thought because I don't want you to not know this. At every let me turn that off. At every legislature, it doesn't matter who's making a record. It is just critical that you make a record. And Laura can talk to you about that, but this is the legal advice. What lawyers need when they're challenging the constitutionality of something, or even the legitimacy of a process for engaging law, it is very, very helpful to say, we told you this was happening. And anybody can make a record. They can send a letter, but what you need to do is testify and say, even if you're quaking in your shoes, all you have to do is, now most operations in the legislature do a lot of hearings by Zoom, and you can just show up and say, hi, I'm Betsy Bramborg. I am very disturbed about this proposed legislation, or I support it depending on the circumstances. But in Montana so far, I haven't had that opportunity. And what you say is, I'm submitting my comments for the record. I just want you, so I hope that you will take the opportunity to read the 2 pages or 1 page or 3 paragraphs I'm submitting, and they go from there. And then when the lawyers litigate it, they can say, this isn't news to anybody. This one person talked about it at the hearing. And then the other legislators who haven't had an opportunity to even catch a breath to figure out what was going on, they've been given a vocabulary. You know, what shocked me when I worked for Max Baucus in DC is how everybody at the legislative level on the national level, also they're posers. Because when you see these 900-page bills, has anybody read them? No. Are they relying on someone saying, here's what I put in the bill? Are there a lot of little goose eggs and Easter eggs in those bills? Yes, it's just by the seat of the pants. And that's frightening and should be frightening to everybody. And so when I left there, I think at one point I might even said to Laura, this world rolls on in spite of its best efforts. But there were like 7 or 8 key legislators that were responsible for everything that was happening at the federal level. And the same is true for state legislatures usually. And you guys can figure that out. So,
I, I want to talk a little bit about how insidious this is because many times what the proposal is seems very innocuous on its face. And for example, I want to talk about in Montana, one of the things that happened first is the the state government changed the way judges are appointed when a judge retires or dies in office or becomes sick. So Betsy, can you describe to the court, to everyone, how we used to appoint judges?
well, we've always elected them, and then we also had a Judicial Nominations Commission that was fairly balanced between the parties by appointment, or and so it was, I can't remember how many people were on the commission, Laura, but it was really well balanced and it was very thoughtfully done. And what they ultimately did was create an entire new process where the governor is in charge of selecting those commission members, and the governor is in charge of selecting the person who ultimately becomes a judge. We still have judicial elections for seats that are open, and quite a few judges do it that way, but also some judges have chosen to, and under this new process, just step aside to give the governor the latitude to make the appointments. And this is one of the critical issues that you guys should be aware of. There are like 5 ways that we get judges in our state courts. In Montana, we elect them unless they leave early, and we just talked about that. And our elections are nonpartisan. So even though all the other candidates have R's and D's next to their name, the judges don't. So the challenge is that you actually have to learn about these people in order to vote for them, and people don't want it to be that way. They just want to allow folk who just go in and vote based on the letter next to the name. But that's one of the ways, is the nonpartisan elections. 7 states have partisan elections already, and generally those don't bode well for most of the states because those are often Republican leaning states. 10 states have governor appoint the judge, and those are states mostly in the Northeast. Then there's some hybrids and legislative appointments. And then there's this merit selection, which sometimes is called the Missouri Plan. The applicants apply, they go through a commission, and then the governor appoints. And those commissions are usually pretty balanced. They're not balanced in Montana at all anymore because of the changes made at the legislative level.
And it, what has happened to that is it's turned all of our even non-judicial races into extraordinarily expensive operations. at the state level. If you look most recently at the Wisconsin election, it's a nonpartisan election, but Elon Musk threw 17 million into that nonpartisan judicial Supreme Court justice election in Wisconsin. It's a small, not all that significant of a state. Montana, how many dollars did they put into the judicial race in Montana this year for the Supreme Court?
I don't remember, but it's millions. And I do know I'm going to use a site from a different race, Senator Tester's race. So in the 15 years since Citizens United, which just allowed a corporation to donate, right? That opened the floodgates. And so when Tester ran initially, he spent $27.5 million and that was in 2006. This last race was 275 million. It just was, and the money is pouring in. And since we're talking about money, where's the money coming from? Well, it's now this is an older publication, 2019. It's on our website, which is branch.org, and you spell out third. It's by an outfit called True North. It's called Who is Targeting State Supreme Courts to Limit Our Freedoms? And there are 4 billionaires that are part of the funding apparatus for these efforts to change how things operate at the state level. And the billions are and the millions and millions are pouring in. I mean, we used to have legislative races where people would be insane to spend $5,000 to $10,000, and now we have races where people are going into debt and losing spectacularly. But the 4 billionaires are Leonard Leo, I'm sure you've heard of him, Dick Uihlein, Uihlein, Charles Koch, and Jeff Yaz. And Jeff, somebody here is from, Susan, you're from Pennsylvania. Jeff's in Pennsylvania. He's really tried to take over the entire operation in Pennsylvania. And it says, which states are they targeting? Montana, Michigan, Ohio, Kentucky, North Carolina, Texas, and Arizona. And the Brennan Center people actually said to me a couple months ago, September, that Montana and Texas were the microcosms because they could get further with fewer dollars here. So you want to keep one eye on what's going on here. And the way to keep an eye on it is look at our website, because we're the ones going, hey, anybody out there? We're going under. We could use some help. And people are catching on. And it was really a shot in the arm to hear the Brennan Center telling the rest of the states, the other district court judges across the nation, pay attention to what's happening here because it's about to happen with you too. And it's all money from these very conservative outlets. It really is part of Project 2025 and the Heritage Foundation. You can't have separation of powers and co-equal branches of governments in a democracy if you have broken the court system. And what they're doing actively in Montana is breaking the court system and then saying, see, it doesn't. I mean, we are saying we need more district court judges and we need more law clerks to help them, because an average district court judge in Montana is handling 1,000 cases a year. Can you imagine 1,000 cases a year? And we're saying we need to help them with that. And they're going, oh, no. And if you break it, then you get to point at it and say it's not working. And that's kind of
So
the MO.
another tactic that has been tried in Montana that Betsy and I, as egghead lawyers, think is interesting is the writ of mandamus. So, Betsy, what's a writ of mandamus?
Oh, God, you know what? I didn't go down that rat hole today. So
Well,
you,
I'll tell
okay.
everybody what a
Yeah.
writ of mandamus is. The one thing that lawyers always have, if the legislature or the governor or your county commissioner won't do what the law says they have to do, we can go to the court and say, court, give me a writ of mandamus telling that county commissioner that they have to do their job and, for example, issue me my driver's license, or they have to let me vote, or those any sort of power that a public official has. If they won't transact that business that they're required to transact, we can get a writ of mandamus. Well, in Montana this year, they are proposing to have it such that the House of Representatives, the Senate, or the AG's office, or the governor can override a writ of mandamus. So let's say the county commissioner won't issue, or in Montana, it's more the treasurer's office won't sell me my driver's license for whatever reason. I'm black, I'm green, I'm female, I don't know. I could go to the court and say, court, tell the county treasurer to sell me my driver's license. And if the AG didn't like me, the AG can say, nope, Laura can't have one. In other words, he can overrule the judicial branch without an appeal, without the right to go all the way to the Montana Supreme Court. Nothing. All of a sudden, they have complete control over court rulings if you lose the writ of mandamus. And that's a proposal in Montana,
And
a
it had,
serious proposal.
and it was, and I'm sorry that I blanked there, but and it had so much momentum. And this is interesting. It goes back to where is this coming from? Uh, Actually, the Chief Justice asked one of the sponsors of one of these bills, and I don't think it might have been mandamus, it might have been something else. And he said, have you ever witnessed a court proceeding? And the lawyer who was behind the legislator who was behind this said, no, but I've watched it on TV. So we're working with an incredibly uninformed community, and the people who were submitting these very complicated proposals um, didn't know what they were talking about. And then the other challenge in Montana was that the testimony was limited to 2 minutes on big ideas like mandamus. And so the testimony was limited. The hearings, we had a time when they wanted to appoint all the judges in Montana by the governor. It was introduced, I have a note here somewhere, but I'm gonna kind of spitball it. It was the bill was introduced on a Wednesday, heard on a Thursday. They took executive action on a Friday, and it was voted on Saturday. In 4 days, they were trying to change how the entire structure works. And we killed it, but only because we practically killed ourselves trying to kill it, just with, reaching out to everybody you can, saying, stop it, stop it. It was really pretty remarkable.
So,
Uh,
Betsy, is your group a group of all left leaning Democrats,
Oh,
the
no, not
Friends
at
of the
all.
Third Branch?
What is really fabulous about this, because I knew that we were not going to get anywhere if we didn't have any credibility, especially if we were all considered leaning. So, I don't know if you recognize the name Mark Roscoe, but he was our governor. He was also George Bush's lawyer and head of the National Republican Party. So he was my biggest Republican, but then I pulled in as many Republicans as I knew exist, any of the people that I could think of that would provide some balance and perspective. And in the early days, and we're still trying to maintain a very thoughtful approach to all of the matters. And what we're also trying to do is just give very clear information about here's what this means, and hoping that the world that controls these decisions ultimately can figure out which side of the line they fall on. One of the bills this last session was interesting because it wanted to open up the Supreme Court deliberations, and Supreme Court deliberations are usually, well, they're not usually, they're confidential. They don't even let law clerks in there while they're hammering things out. And that made it all, though. They said, nope, we're going to open that up and allow reporters into the deliberations on these complex legal issues, and made it through the legislature. And our Republican governor, who was quite conservative and bought the office, which pretty much most people would agree because he's not of Montana, he vetoed it. Even he said that went too far. And other notable high-end Montana Republicans are referring to this ultra-conservative stuff and the ultra-conservatives as cavemen. And so they are working from that angle, and we're just trying to provide the information as directly as we can, saying, here's the language. So I wanted to tell you about the other challenges you're all going to confront because this is happening. So if you don't have partisan judicial elections, you're going to see that in your state. What they've also done is they're trying to change the venue components. Venue is where you file legal action. If they change it the way they want to change it, then there's this thing called judge shopping, where you're like, I kind of appreciate how that judge might rule on this because of other rulings, so I want to make sure this issue goes before him or her.
It's like why all of the immigration cases are in Louisiana.
Right. Exactly. Federal and yeah, gerrymandering, excuse me, judge shopping and venue shopping absolutely happens in federal courts. We're trained on it in law school on how to find your venue and make sure you got the right thing. We had they're gerrymandering your state judicial election districts to try and unelect certain types of judges. They've totally, and in Montana, they totally took this by storm. They changed how judges are disciplined, and they're trying to change the rules of judicial conduct, but they don't get to do that. That's unconstitutional, and that'll hopefully not go too far. But they have added so many political appointees to our judicial discipline process that any judge is not going to get a fair or balanced jury of the judicial disciplinary body because it's all MAGA. I mean, they got that in there.
So
This is the mandamus. They're limiting authority of courts to decide certain issues, and they're also limiting the remedies, and they're limiting the court's ability to enforce their decisions. And then so those are the main topics. And on our website, there is a link to the Brennan Center, and the Brennan Center has these reports where they talk about these different attacks and where they're happening. And I gave Laura the information, and she can maybe forward it to you guys if you want to see what's happening in your state. Because what the Brennan Center does is it's saying, here's what happened in Kentucky, here's what's happening in Montana, and then we can all learn from the challenges. But one of the things they did here is they tried to create this, they called it a chancery court. And they said, oh, we're going to create this special 3-person court, and it's going to just address land use issues and business issues and constitutional issues. But they just slipped the constitutional issues in on the side. And the governor's going to be in charge of appointing all 3 justices on this chancery court. And my God, nobody, calling it a chancery court. Well, that was snooze. They use vocabulary that is intended to make people look away because it's one of those things where you're like, I don't want to learn about that. And so it took a lot to inspire people to pay attention. And then what was interesting is when we did the deep dive, and your legislatures have this too. We call it, I don't know what they call it in other states. In Montana, it's called a junk file, Junque. And it is the public record behind legislation. And what you want to do is you can look at that and see who was behind, what lobbyist drafted this and gave it to that legislator, which community gave it to the legislator so that they could take off and run with it. And they never know what they're talking about. You can talk to them for 5 minutes and they cannot hold their own on any, well, or at least this was my experience. When you say, why are you doing this? What is this for? They can't, they speak the talking points for about 3 or 4 minutes. They'll just spout that and then they're stuck. But that's here. So Chancery courts, they're going to call it something, but they're just stripping the courts of or fairly appointed courts, fairly elected courts of their ability to make these critical decisions, and they're just taking it into a whole new channel. So I wanted to make sure you knew about that. And you really should go to the Brennan Center and see their stuff to see where your state fits. Because, if you don't have a functioning judiciary, you don't have a functioning democracy. It's pretty much that simple.
Nor do you have protection of any civil rights, much less protection of women and girls.
Oh, yeah, goes right down the toilet. It really does. So
I
let's,
wanted to take a couple minutes, Betsy, although you and I could talk all day. Does anybody have questions, comments, thoughts? Raise your hand and I'll call on you.
oh, there's a whole bunch of chats.
Well, I've been sending links in the chats.
Oh, good,
That's
good,
me.
good, 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 good.
And we will compile these and send them out, Laura, as well. So you and I will get together and do the resource so that people can pick it up at any time.
We're trying to just give you a really over the top overview. Sally has a question.
Um, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay. Pennsylvania just had elections, and according to the numbers you were citing in Montana, I know that millions and millions were spent on this election, but not maybe several million, but not in the double digits. But at any rate, we just had an election where we could either retain or force our judges to have to be elected. And they put a really strong case together, and Pennsylvania affirmed that we would keep our judges, the three judges. And I just wondered if you are familiar with the campaign they used to do that, because from what I understand, it was a very effective one.
No, I'm not, but I'll look at it. I mean, that would be really helpful.
I-
Um,
In addition to, I mean, they obviously, our governor supported it. He came out in ads, and then and they had a number of public agencies supporting these three judges. But the one comment was, if indeed they become elected, the wasted money that goes into these elections is incredible.
and it's only increasing, and I wish I had more numbers on that for you, but what we have right now is a proposed initiative that they have to limit the amount of money that entities can contribute to different races because, and I have a statistic here somewhere that just talks about how people are unhappy about, I don't have it, I have it, but I don't have it.
And that's
on money that's going into they don't want money in judicial campaigns. Here it is. Uh, so even though we know that the legislature right now in Montana and apparently Congress, checks and balances aren't appealing to them, but it resonates, and that's the phrase to use. Checks and balances is the phrase that resonates with most people. Their fifth grade training kicks in. So they said 64% of the 800 pooled said they didn't want partisan races. They don't want money in judicial campaigns. They want to vote for the person, not the party. So we got that. And then but the legislators that think partisan judicial races are a good idea are saying, well, just come out from behind the curtain. We know you were a Democrat or a Republican or an independent. And now that you're going to be a judge, you're just going to vote that way if an important big issue comes to you. Well, the number of important big issues is so small, but of course so critical. So judges don't deal with that kind of stuff every day. And when it does come down the pike to them, what I know about Montana's bench right now is they work very hard to avoid their biases and they stick to what they see as the law and the facts. And I know several district court judges who have ruled on these larger issues where it is not how they feel about it, but they're looking at the law and they're looking at the facts and they're saying, well, I guess this is the way it's going to go. So we're stuck there, but I wanted to money in politics. They are trying with this initiative. I hope they get the signatures, but it's such a dense issue. They've got to go out and get a huge number of signatures to even get it on the ballot. And so that's another uphill push in Montana, but at least it's
Julie,
raising the issue.
Julie has a question. I'll call on her.
Okay.
Okay, so my question is in Utah, this is where I live right now. We've had this whole Prop 4, the judge picked our maps. I mean, there's so much misinformation going on around how the map was drawn, who drew it. There a lot of people are claiming the judge drew it. It's like, yeah, right. But we have I don't even know what these guys, they're a nonprofit, but it's called Securing American Greatness. They just donated $4 million to go after this hearing and this Supreme Court ruling. How do I there's so much misinformation. I don't even know where to begin to I have contacted my state rep and my senator, sent them all the information I know. And the sad thing is they don't even know what's going on. They have no clue. They know exactly what I told them or what someone else on the floor told them. And I'm just like, how is it that this is so, how do you not understand the judicial branch of your government? You're serving in it.
Okay, so breaking that down, there is a legislative history on just about everything, and usually it's available through record searches. You can look at the legislative history of a bill. Backing up, the judge in making his decision doesn't get to make it based on what he pulls out of the air or she pulls out of there. They have to have some form of record, some material that they are citing. So when you look at a judicial decision, it will cite different documents or materials or decisions, other court decisions saying, here's how we came to this. So the judge in the decision, you'll see what that person was thinking. If it on the legislation, there's going to be a record. That's what I was calling the junk file, or what they call it in Montana. It's the legislative history.
I need to find that in Utah. I need to figure out what that is. Would my legislator know what that is?
Yeah, they would know. You just say, I need a legislative history on this. And then there are all these people called legislative council in your Utah legislature. And there is a staff, I'm sure it's of 100 people or more, and they will have the record. And now we have a fabulous constitution with from 1972 with open records requirements, and a lot of other good things are in our constitution, including the right to privacy, which was the basis for our abortion decision, which I think is kind of relevant to all of you guys, but for the work you're doing. The right to privacy is pivotal. So we have one of the more progressive things, but constitutions, but what you will be able to do is talk to your legislature, or even if you happen to be in the Capitol, go say, where is the Legislative Council's office?
Okay.
And then talk to that and then say, who in the Legislative Council office handled this matter? And I don't know, in Montana, I'd get to talk to that staff person. I don't know what would happen in Utah. So
I'm not even a lawyer. Like I'm
no, you don't have to be. You
Okay.
don't
have to be.
And most of the Legislative Council people are not lawyers either.
Okay.
Patton has a question.
Yeah, I'd just like to just for clarifying, I don't live in the States, but I imagine in the influence spheres, it's the same in somewhat in Canada. When you say your group, when you were aware of things and you got organized and you lobbied or you spoke to them, is them only the state legislators that you spoke with and lobbied about voting, I'm presuming against some things, or did you also do public campaigns? When you say you mobilized, who did you mobilize to so that you could
that's so good. That's such a great question. It's just me, right? And 3 old boys, and only one of them really did stuff, right? The other 2 were lobbying behind the scenes, and actually one of them had cancer most of the time, and he's back up and running now, and he's our secret weapon. And I've got a couple secret weapon old boy lobbyists that I reach out to and go, what do you hear? But we never had the resources. I mean, right now I have $2,600 to go into 2026. This was volunteers. But when I hired the lobbyists, the people we were reaching out to were primarily legislators, because I didn't have the wherewithal to do any kind of public campaigning. The other thing is I reached out to the other nonprofits, and you know how when your little kid grabs your face when they're about 2 or 3 and they go, look at me, and they're getting your attention? That's essentially what I had to do, because my issues seemed so boring and they didn't want to pay attention to them. They wanted the big issues, and I'm sitting there going, these are big issues and you need to stop and pay attention. We wanted to do more of a public campaign. We don't have the resources to do that. I had a couple of advantages, because then the reporters caught into what we were trying to do, and the fact that our resources were available to explain these complicated things. And so they were using them, and they were tracking. But again, it was a flood the zone moment. Nobody buys newspapers anymore. Nobody gets their news from one channel anymore. We don't have a social media presence at all, because I don't have the time or the inclination to keep that rolling. They have told me do a blog, and I went, I don't want to do that either. I'm just going to keep here's what this bill is, here's what it would do, here's how it's going to have a roll down the hill impact. But so making relationships with the press is kind of a critical thing.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that I've seen Betsy do pretty effectively is, while she says she talks to legislatures, these issues went out to the lawyers statewide, at least within the group that subscribed to the Friends of the Third Branch. And while they may not have responded to Betsy directly, they were talking locally to local constituents, to, at least I know I was, to my local legislators, although Betsy knows mine and they're useless. Um, I can't talk to them, but by talking to people locally, they would talk to my legislators that won't listen to Laura. Um, and so I do think, Betsy, behind the scenes, you are really effective that way. It got out to the eastern ends and wilds of Montana where it's really hard to reach. Montana's a weird state because the western part of it is served by Idaho TV, and the eastern part is served by North Dakota TV, and the northern part is served by Canadian TV. We don't have good statewide news. Not and newspapers either.
Yeah.
Newspapers are not statewide particularly either. They act like they are, but they aren't.
What I was doing is we were sending out at least once a week our fact sheets, and here's what we're hearing, and here's what this means. And people were signing, once we had the website, you could sign up for our emails. And so they were getting our emails saying, here's what's going on. And there's another pivotal person in this process, and his name is Dennis Lopatch, and he's my partner in this project. And it turns out we make a pretty good team. He lives in Missoula. I live in Helena, 2.5 hours away. And we would just say, okay, what does everybody, where are we most concerned right now? So we ended up, so as I told you, we have 2,900 subscribers. Most of those are lawyers. Somehow it got our stuff went out into the wild, and we got a bunch of doctors that signed up too. So a website was pivotal to grow the information. And then Laura may not be able to talk to her legislator, but again, it's 2 degrees of separation for the deep Montanans here. So I was able to call my brother and say, hey, you've got a really conservative legislator over in your community, but do you ever see him socially? And oh yeah, I saw him last week. And it wasn't just that, it was me talking to as many lawyers as I could in the different communities, and we targeted the legislators that we thought were paying enough attention and smart enough to help us head a lot of this stuff off. But it was just a bloodbath, and part of the reason I can't remember stuff is I have a certain amount of PTSD from having gone full speed for 4 months and saying, okay, who will do this for us next session? And as far as I can tell, nobody. So and I wanted to touch on that. Our state bar association isn't an association. It's association implies you sign up voluntarily, right? And ours is a mandatory entity. And I think in Canada, they're also mandatory. Most of the state bars are, if you want to practice law in that state, you have to be a member of that bar. Those entities should spark up. Maybe Montana's isn't, but your state entities might engage. And that's the regulatory element. There are also voluntary associations like the trial lawyers associations and the defense trial lawyers associations. They have just as big a stake. And those were, I was working with those groups going, hey, defense trial lawyers, those are the guys who represent the insurance companies and corporations and things like that. And the business lawyers. And I would just reach out to the king or queen of each of those, the women's law section, the new lawyers law section. We have the Indian law section, and I would just figure out where these little groups, clusters are. And if you look at, and usually your mandatory associations or your mandatory entities and the various associations just kind of give you a sense of things, and you can reach to them and say, what are you doing about this? Or are you tracking it? I think a lot of them are starting to pay attention, but Montana was the only place where they flooded the zone with everything all at once. And you guys are going to get picked off one by one.
Yeah. We're at the end of our hour. I want to thank Betsy. Any other really quick questions?
I can direct you to resources in your states because I've been paying a little bit more attention to that. And I would really commend to you to reach out also to the Brennan Center to see if they have information specific to your state so you can get a jump on it and reach out to, well, because the League of Women Voters, for example, really engaged on these issues. They saw how difficult this was. So I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all.
Betsy and Laura, thank you so very much. This has quite informative. And I know, as Sally had mentioned about here in Pennsylvania, it was amazing the money that was spent for these three people. And but thank goodness they were retained. So again, thank you. Thank you to everyone. Happy holidays, and we'll see you in January. Our, as I said, January.